So I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you have a patient in an intensive care unit.
Okay.
And they are, completely sedated, critically ill,
Right.
totally dependent on a mechanical ventilator just to breathe.
Right.
Now imagine a really prominent doctor going on national television and proposing that to save resources, we should take a second critically ill patient and just hook them up to that exact same machine.
Oh.
Yeah, using just a little balloon and some plastic tubing. I mean, it sounds like this desperate, brilliant MacGyver-style hack.
I mean, yeah, it sounds brilliant, but only until you actually understand the basic physics of human lungs.
Right.
Yeah.
Because lung compliance, the elasticity of the tissue, it's different for every single person.
Right, of course.
So if you put two people on one ventilator, the air is just going to take the path of least resistance.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So if patient A has really stiff lungs, from a severe infection, and patient B has relatively elastic lungs, well, almost all of the air volume gets forced into patient B.
Yeah.
Exactly. You end up overinflating and potentially just rupturing patient B's lungs, while patient A is essentially slowly suffocating. It is mechanically impossible and honestly inherently deadly.
But the wild part is, when that idea was pitched on Dutch television, right in the middle of the pandemic, the political establishment didn't just nod along. They actively subsidized it.
Yeah, they really did.
The health minister even visited the hospital to support it. It was this dangerous illusion of innovation, and nobody, not one person in the medical establishment, publicly stepped up to stop the circus.
Which is pretty terrifying when you think about it.
It totally is. And that right there, that specific tension between, biological reality, scientific silence, and just pure political theater, that is the entire engine of our deep dive today.
Yeah, we are getting into some really heavy stuff.
We are taking you inside this highly charged, incredibly revealing live event that happened in The Hague.
And the context of this event is super crucial. What we are looking at today is a live broadcast transcript from a Dutch YouTube channel called Dwarsnieuws.
Cross News, right?
Right. Hosted by Marianne Zwagerman. But this wasn't just some casual studio recording. This was a physical, in-person gathering held on the exact same day that several key figures were literally testifying just down the street before the official Dutch parliamentary inquiry into the COVID-19 response.
So for anyone listening outside the Netherlands, you have to imagine something like a high-stakes sworn testimony congressional hearing.
Right, exactly.
Digging into every single decision made during the pandemic lockdowns. And Zwagerman co-organized this parallel citizen-led event with an organization called De Vierde Golf, or the Fourth Wave.
Yeah, and they basically describe themselves as advocates for a crisis-resilient democracy.
And the roster of voices they put on that stage, it's basically a heavyweight lineup of the government's most prominent, highly credentialed critics.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about people who were either inside the rooms where it happened or right on the front lines dealing with the fallout.
Give us a quick rundown of who was there.
Sure. So you have Mona Keijzer, a former state secretary. She was a cabinet member who actually got dismissed from the government because of her outspoken criticism of the Corona pass.
Wow.
Yeah. Then you have Maurice de Hond, who is a really deeply influential statistician and pollster. Dr. Jonah Walk, a specialized vaccine scientist and a physician.
Okay, so serious medical credentials.
Very serious. Also, Professor Armand Gerbs, one of the top intensivists, ICU doctors in the entire country.
Right.
Plus Renske Leijten, a fiercely respected former member of parliament, famously known for exposing massive governmental scandals. And finally, Martin Smits, who is a philosopher of science.
Okay, so before we really get into the meat of what these people actually said, we need to draw a very, very hard line about how we are approaching this material today.
Definitely.
Because the source transcript we're analyzing today, it contains some really intense, highly charged political, scientific, and social viewpoints.
Yeah, they pull no punches.
Right. These speakers are making profound, sweeping critiques of the Dutch government's handling of the pandemic, the implementation of vaccines, and, the suspension of democratic rights.
And our mandate for this deep dive, just to be super clear, is to be entirely analytical, not ideological.
Exactly. We are not taking sides.
Right. Our goal is absolutely not to validate or endorse or even debunk the viewpoints of the speakers on that stage.
Doesn't matter where they fall on the political spectrum, left or right.
Not at all. Our sole mission here is to impartially deconstruct this specific event. We just want to help you understand the exact arguments, the deep institutional frustrations, and those sort of philosophical frameworks these individuals are presenting.
Right. We're here to map out the anatomy of their argument.
Hmm.
And that argument fundamentally revolves around this massive collision, like a literal crash between technocratic crisis management and the fundamental rights of a democracy.
Yeah, and the event dives right into the deep end with Mona Keijzer.
She comes in hot, doesn't she?
Oh, yeah. She arrives at this venue in The Hague literally minutes after stepping down from the witness stand at that formal parliamentary inquiry we mentioned.
Oh, wow. So she's probably still running on adrenaline.
The adrenaline of giving sworn testimony is, like, palpable in the transcript. She makes this sweeping historical claim right out of the gate. She states unequivocally that during the pandemic, the democratic rule of law gloriously failed.
Gloriously failed. That's a heavy phrase.
Very. And to explain how that failure happened, she introduces this concept of the funnel. The Dutch word she uses is voek, which is, it's like a woven fish trap.
Okay, like one of those traps where the fish swims in, but it can't swim out.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
designed so that once you swim in, the current and the physical structure make it completely impossible to turn around and escape.
And she's saying the cabinet's decision-making process became that trap.
Yes. She argues it consistently, inevitably led to more restrictive measures with literally no mechanism to reverse course. She describes being inside the cabinet and experiencing what she calls a mirror palace of reasoning.
Okay, let's unpack this mirror palace, because it's a really fascinating look at how power operates under panic.
Yeah, so the architecture of that mirror palace was entirely built on delegation. When the politicians in the cabinet were faced with a massive crisis decision, they didn't rely on political debate.
Like they normally would.
Right. Instead, they deferred entirely to the outbreak management team, the OMT.
Okay.
And the OMT, in turn, heavily deferred to mathematical models created by a very small, specific group of epidemiological modelers.
Let me stop you there.
Mm-hmm.
Because treating mathematical models as absolute truth seems like a massive vulnerability.
Oh, it's huge.
I mean, anyone who works with data knows that epidemiological models, like, say, a SIR-R model tracking susceptible, infected, and recovered populations, they are built on massive assumptions.
Right, you have to guess so many variables.
You're guessing the transmission rate, human behavioral changes, viral mutation rates. They produce these enormous confidence intervals. They aren't crystal ball predictions.
And that is exactly the critical flaw that Keijzer highlights. In a scientific setting, a model is just a tool for exploring scenarios, complete with really wide margins of error.
Yeah.
But in this political mirror palace, those margins of error were just quietly stripped away. The model's median projection was suddenly treated as a deterministic law of physics.
Like it was gospel.
Exactly. Keijzer gives this really raw example from inside the cabinet. She would push back against the consensus. She would ask, why can't we open the restaurants? We have to weigh the social isolation and the economic devastation against the viral risk.
Right, so she was trying to force a traditional political debate, like let's balance these competing societal needs.
Precisely. But she says she was shut down, not with a political counterargument, but with a spreadsheet.
A spreadsheet.
Yeah. The response she got was literally, the models predict that if we open the restaurants, we will have exactly 100 to 130 more ICU admissions.
Wait, exactly 100 to 130? That specific number is doing a ton of heavy lifting there.
It shuts down the debate entirely.
Because if the overriding singular metric for the entire government is just prevent the ICUs from overflowing, then 130 admissions isn't a variable to be weighed, it's a veto.
And that creates the closed loop of the mirror palace. Think about it. The politicians point to the OMT to avoid making a hard choice.
Right.
The OMT points to the mathematical model to justify their advice. Policy couldn't be debated politically because the model's output was weaponized as this unquestionable mathematical certainty.
But hold on, the democratic rule of law isn't just the cabinet. What about the judiciary?
Good question.
Right. If a government overreaches and essentially rules by spreadsheet, isn't it the fundamental job of a judge to step in, look at the Constitution and say, hey, you cannot suspend these rights based on a theoretical model?
You would think so, yeah. But Keijzer points out that the judicial system got trapped in the exact same mirror palace. Largely because of how administrative law functions in the Netherlands. When citizens or advocacy groups sued the government over, say, lockdowns or curfews, they expected the judge to weigh the actual medical validity of the measures against their constitutional rights.
Right. They wanted a ruling on whether the lockdown actually made sense.
Exactly. But the judges generally applied what is known as marginal review. In Dutch, it's marginal toetsing.
Marginal assessing, meaning they aren't looking at the actual substance of the rule.
Right. Under marginal review, the judge doesn't ask, is a curfew actually effective at stopping a virus?
Okay.
Or are the OMT's models biologically sound? The judge only asks, did the minister follow the correct procedural steps? And did they have the legal authority to base their decision on the advice of their appointed experts?
Oh, wow. So it's essentially just a procedural checklist.
Very much.
The judge asks, does the emergency law allow the health minister to consult the OMT? Yes. Did the minister consult the OMT? Yes. Did the minister write down that they are following the OMT's advice? Yes. Okay, case closed. The government wins.
It completes the circle of unaccountability. The politicians hide behind the experts hide behind the mathematical models, and the judges validate the politicians' right to hide behind the experts.
That is wild.
Yeah, no single human being in that entire chain is required to take moral or political responsibility for the crushing weight of the lockdowns. The system isn't making choices, it's just executing an algorithm.
It's like driving a car relying entirely on a GPS that you know is glitching.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. You can physically see a massive lake through the windshield, but the GPS says continue straight for 100 meters. And because the legal and political rule of the car is always follow the GPS, you just drive straight into the water because you can't argue with the computer.
That reliance on the GPS, especially during a terrifying, unprecedented crisis, it offers this profound psychological comfort to leadership.
Oh, I'm sure it does.
Think about the moral burden on a prime minister. If they stand up and say, I am personally choosing to keep schools and restaurants closed, knowing it will bankrupt families and damage child development because I believe it's the safest path, well, they own that destruction.
It is entirely on their conscience.
Exactly.
Which is a massive political liability.
But if they say the model dictates that opening restaurants yield 130 deaths, therefore my hands are tied, well, the model becomes a moral shield. It depoliticizes what is inherently a deeply political act.
The confiscation of a citizen's basic freedoms.
Exactly.
This philosophical friction is highlighted so beautifully by an anecdote Keijzer shares in the transcript about her own teenage son.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating story.
It really is. So it's a Sunday morning during the lockdown era. He's coming downstairs after a night out with his friends, which, implies he was probably already bending some of the strict gathering rules.
Right.
And she tells him, you shouldn't visit your grandmother this week. And his response is just fascinating. He doesn't roll his eyes. He is actively indignant. He looks at her and says, what did you think, man?
He was insulted.
Yes.
He was offended that the authority figure in the room assumed he lacked the moral agency to just protect his own vulnerable family member.
Right. Because what did you think? Man basically means, of course I wasn't going to visit grandma after being in a crowd. I have common sense and I love her.
Yeah.
And Keijzer uses this to argue a core conservative democratic principle. A functional society requires the government to trust its citizens to manage their own local vulnerabilities.
Yes.
Instead of trying to micromanage every single human interaction with blanket, coercive national rules, you just have to trust that the vast majority of people do not want to actively kill their grandmothers.
Which is the exact antithesis of the technocratic approach.
How so?
Well, the technocratic model does not view the population as moral agents with common sense. It views them as biological vectors.
Just nodes in a network?
Right. They are variables in an epidemiological equation that must be controlled and restricted and monitored to achieve a specific numerical outcome on a government dashboard.
And if the citizens are just biological vectors that need to be controlled, then you need a very specific type of driver in the car to enforce that control.
Right.
Which leads to a massive revelation in the transcript. This structural shift in how the Dutch government organized its response. They didn't just rely on health officials. They literally handed the steering wheel to a national security agency.
This is where the panel's critique moves from, just a debate about public health into a really deep warning about state power. The speakers focus heavily on the role of the NCTV.
The National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism.
Yes.
Which is wild. Why on earth is the agency responsible for stopping bomb plots and active shooters, coordinating the response to a respiratory virus?
That is the exact question Keijzer and the panel are raising. They note that Prime Minister Mark Rutte specifically requested the NCTV to take a leading, coordinating role in managing the crisis response.
Basically sidelining traditional public health infrastructure.
Exactly.
But what does that bureaucratic shift actually change on the ground? I mean, If the goal is still stop the virus, does it really matter if the health ministry or the security ministry is holding the clipboard?
It changes the entire paradigm of the response. Think about it. When public health officials manage a crisis, the framework is historically holistic.
They look at the whole picture.
Right. They consider sociology, behavioral psychology, voluntary compliance, community health. But when you put a security and counterterrorism agency in charge, the crisis is instantly viewed through a military and policing lens.
Ah, I see. So the virus becomes a hostile invader,
Yeah,
and the citizens become potential national security threats if they don't comply.
exactly. The whole vocabulary of the state changes. You stop hearing about social cohesion and you start hearing about march routes, enforcing compliance, surveillance, mitigating immediate threats to state stability.
Because the NCTV is trained for acute, malicious threats.
Right, where command and control authoritarianism is basically the only functional option. You don't ask citizens for their input during a terrorist attack. You give them orders.
And Marta J. Smits, the philosopher of science on the panel, she points out that this shift to the NCTV is the ultimate manifestation of technocracy.
Yeah, and the way she defines technocracy here is vital for you to understand.
Right.
Because it explains exactly how political power hides itself. She argues that technocracy is the process of masking ideological choices behind experts.
So that the choices become depoliticized.
Right, and therefore immune to democratic pushback. Because if a health minister proposes a mandate, Parliament can debate the medical proportionality of it.
They can argue the science.
Yeah, but if the National Counterterrorism Coordinator classifies a mandate as a matter of urgent national security, the political debate is instantly paralyzed.
Who wants to be the politician arguing against national security?
Nope.
And the panel makes a very deliberate point to prove this isn't just, a historical critique of the COVID years. They draw a direct parallel to the ongoing massive political crisis in the Netherlands regarding nitrogen emissions.
The Stikstof crisis.
Right, the one that sparked those massive farmer protests that made global headlines.
The parallel is honestly striking. In the nitrogen crisis, the government relies heavily on a mathematical model called ARIUS.
Okay.
And they use it to calculate the exact nitrogen deposition of individual farms onto protected nature reserves.
And based on that specific algorithm, the state is telling generational farmers they have to shut down their operations permanently.
Yes. And the panel argues that just like during COVID, the government is completely bypassing the democratic debate about the future of agriculture by just pointing to the model.
So the political choice of whether to prioritize a specific ecological metric over, say, national food security and rural economies?
It's masked as an unavoidable mathematical necessity. The model says nitrogen is too high, therefore the farms must close.
It's the classic computer says no style of governance.
Exactly. It's the exact same mirror palace, just with a different coat of paint.
And the real-world impact of this security mindset overriding democratic norms gets incredibly dark, but also strangely absurd.
Oh, yeah.
Smits shares a story from May 2020 that honestly sounds like a glitch in the Matrix. She and some human rights activists wanted to organize a physical meeting to discuss, ironically enough, political fundamental rights.
And this wasn't a massive concert, right? This was just a political assembly.
Right, and a judge actually banned the physical gathering.
Mm-hmm.
Let me guess the judge's reasoning here. Did they look at it as a purely biological risk rather than a constitutional right? Did they just tell them to meet online?
That is exactly what happened. The judge ruled that because the technology existed, they could simply use Zoom to have their meeting.
You're kidding.
Nope. And therefore, the judge said their right to assembly wasn't being violated. It was just being, digitized.
Smits is absolutely furious about this in the transcript, and rightly so. She argues that this fundamentally misunderstands what the right to assembly actually is.
Oh, totally.
The right to assemble isn't just about the sterile exchange of audio and video data over a server that the government can monitor. It is about physical solidarity. It is about the shared presence of human beings, the spontaneous exchange of ideas, the actual friction of democratic organizing.
She points out that reducing political assembly to a Zoom call is a deeply technocratic view of humanity. That we are all just data processors, and as long as our data can connect, our rights are perfectly intact.
In the broadcast, she and Zwagerman even joke, though it's a very, very dark joke, about how to have a basic political discussion without the government shutting it down, they eventually had to meet secretly in hidden churches.
Right.
Or even consider renting out a sex club in Amsterdam, because the rules for sex work were sometimes less scrutinized than the rules for political protest.
It really highlights the absurdity of the metrics, but the underlying implication is genuinely terrifying. If a government can unilaterally redefine a political assembly as a biological security threat, where does public debate actually happen?
How do you organize resistance against a policy if the act of organizing is outlawed by that very policy?
Exactly.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Goes for it.
Because if I'm listening to this, I'm thinking back to March 2020. The hospitals in northern Italy are collapsing. The morgues in New York are bringing in refrigerated trucks. In that specific moment of terror and unknown, don't you actually need a military-style command and control response?
It's a fair question.
You can't convene a leisurely town hall debate about constitutional rights while the hospital system is literally collapsing, right?
That is a highly valid challenge, and it's one the panel does not ignore. They actually concede that in the very acute phase of a novel crisis, say, the first 2 to 3 weeks, immediate top-down firefighting makes perfect sense.
Right.
When a house is on fire, you grab the hose. You don't form a committee to discuss the water pressure.
So where does the panel say the government crossed the line?
The line is crossed when the state declares that the house is going to be on fire for 2 straight years. And they use that permanent state of emergency to structurally bypass Parliament. A crisis mandate is meant to be a brief pause in democratic norms, not a permanent replacement of them.
Right, because when you maintain a military security mindset for years, it creates this rigid, hostile environment.
Yeah, where questioning the strategy is treated as treason. And what's fascinating and really deeply troubling is that this chilling effect didn't just suppress citizens organizing meetings, it profoundly corrupted the scientific community itself.
Because when you silence the doctors and researchers who are actually looking at the data, you inevitably create massive blind spots in the response.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the scientists on this panel. Dr. Jonah Walk, the vaccine scientist, and Professor Armand Gerbs, the intensivist. Their testimonies about what happened inside the medical establishment are honestly some of the most alarming parts of this entire broadcast.
Dr. Walk's perspective is vital here because she isn't an armchair critic. She is a specialized vaccine researcher, and she describes a very early, very disturbing realization that the public political narrative was detaching completely from the actual scientific data.
Right. She said she was watching television, listening to politicians and senior health officials claim with absolute certainty that the new vaccines were 100% safe.
Yeah.
And more importantly, that they completely stopped viral transmission.
And that second claim, stopping transmission, that was the entire foundational logic for the Corona Pass, or the 2G system implemented across Europe.
Right. The 2G system basically meant you could only participate in society. You know, go to a restaurant, keep your job in some cases if you were vaccinated or recently recovered.
Right.
The logic was, if you are vaccinated, you cannot spread the virus, so you are biologically safe to be around. But Walk knew that was mechanically false, didn't she?
Yeah. Yes. She knew it because she understands exactly how clinical trials are designed. The Phase 3 trials for the major vaccines were designed and powered to test for the prevention of severe symptomatic disease,
Right.
not for sterilizing immunity, which is the ability to completely prevent the virus from replicating in your mucosa and being transmitted to others. The data showing they stopped transmission was incredibly weak, and the long-term safety data literally did not exist yet.
So she does what a good scientist is trained to do. She takes her concerns to her senior colleagues, the veteran doctors in her hospital, and she tries to initiate a scientific debate.
Right.
And the transcript reveals this incredible moment. She says they agreed with her. Behind closed doors, looking strictly at the clinical trial data, these senior scientists admitted she was right.
The data did not support the political claims.
Exactly. But did they support her publicly?
No, not at all. They explicitly warned her that speaking out publicly would completely destroy her career.
Wow.
They told her the topic was, quote, too political. I mean, science is supposed to be the pursuit of empirical truth, but they were essentially telling her that the political narrative had superseded the data.
And when Walk eventually did publish opinion pieces, questioning the necessity of universal vaccination for healthy, low-risk young people, The backlash was vicious.
Yeah, she received emails from within the medical community demanding she be fired, calling her a disgrace to the profession.
That is the textbook definition of a chilling effect.
It really is. And Professor Gerbs, the ICU doctor, he echoes her experience perfectly. He notes that within the medical establishment, it became infinitely easier to just row with the mainstream.
Don't rock the boat.
Exactly. He argues that the fundamental core of the scientific method, which requires constant skepticism, rigorous debate, attempting to falsify hypotheses, it was entirely abandoned in favor of an enforced artificial consensus.
Which brings us right back to the crazy ventilator hack I mentioned at the very beginning of the show.
Yes.
Gerbs brings this exact scenario up in the transcript. Prominent doctors proposing on national TV to split one ventilator between two patients. Gerbs calls it absolute bullshit, pointing out that anyone with a basic understanding of respiratory physiology knew it was a lethal idea.
And as you mentioned earlier, an American anesthesiology journal later formally published a paper proving exactly why it was dangerous and mechanically unviable.
But the tragedy is how the Dutch system reacted before that paper came out. Politicians, desperate for a silver bullet, they loved the idea.
It sounded heroic.
Exactly. The government poured subsidies into developing this useless machine. And Gerbs' main point of fury is that no one in the Dutch medical establishment publicly stood up to stop it.
Yeah.
The experts knew it was nonsense, but they let the politicians run with it on national television because no one wanted to be the one to burst the bubble of consensus.
Maurice de Hond, the statistician on the panel, he chimes in here with a phrase he uses often. He says, "Scientists forgot to be scientists."
What does he mean by that?
He cites the intense groupthink surrounding the origins of the virus. He points out a famous interview where a prominent Dutch virologist was asked about the possibility of the virus originating in a lab in Wuhan.
Right.
The virologist replied on television that the presence of a massive coronavirus research lab in Wuhan had absolutely no association in her mind with the outbreak of a novel coronavirus in that exact same city.
It's cognitive dissonance on a massive scale. I mean, if a bomb goes off next to a fireworks factory, your first thought is probably the fireworks factory.
Exactly.
But because the lab leak theory was politically coded as a right-wing conspiracy at the time, scientists contorted their own logic to avoid being associated with it.
If we connect this to the broader sociological picture, what we are observing is institutional groupthink under extreme stress.
Yeah.
In high-stakes environments, organizations instinctively prioritize internal cohesion over critical evaluation. Gerbs mentions the intense pressure from hospital boards of directors who insisted that the medical institution must speak with one voice.
Basically, the PR department takes over the science department.
Exactly. But in the realm of science, an institution speaking with one voice shouldn't be a comfort. It is a massive, blaring warning sign.
Right, because science is inherently noisy.
Yes. It is a process of constant friction and disagreement. When the scientific community suddenly goes entirely quiet and speaks in perfect unison, it means peer review has failed or dissent has been actively suppressed.
And when you suppress the doctors who are looking at the whole patient, you inevitably create blind spots in patient care. The enforced silence had a devastating physical cost.
It really did.
This moves the conversation to a concept Professor Gerbs introduces that really forces you to reevaluate the entire pandemic narrative. He talks about the unseen collateral damage, and he uses the term code dark gray.
To understand code dark gray, we have to remember the terrifying specter of code black. Throughout the pandemic, the media and the government were constantly warning the public that if we didn't comply with the lockdowns, the hospitals would reach code black.
Code black being the ultimate triage nightmare. The ICUs are physically full, and doctors are forced to stand at the hospital doors and decide who gets a ventilator and who is sent home to die.
Right.
It was the primary justification for every single restriction.
But Gerbs is fiercely critical of how this was framed, specifically the artificial distinction the system created between COVID patients and non-COVID patients.
Yeah, he points out a basic medical truth. In a hospital, we don't divide people into cancer patients and non-cancer patients.
Exactly. We just have patients and they all have a right to care.
And his agonizing point is that while the entire country was obsessed with preventing code black for COVID patients, for everyone else, the non-COVID patients, it was already code black.
That is code dark gray. If you needed a preventative oncology screening or a heart valve replacement or a biopsy, the hospital doors were functionally closed to you.
The system had already triaged you out.
Yes, your care just stopped.
He takes direct aim at the political rhetoric of Prime Minister Rutte and Health Minister Hugo de Jonge. During press conferences, they would repeatedly insist, No one should die of COVID.
Yeah.
And Gerbs, as an ICU doctor who literally manages death on a daily basis, explains how fundamentally absurd and biologically illiterate that statement is.
He touches on a very deep philosophical and cultural issue in the Netherlands, the illusion of the makeability of life.
The Dutch term is Maakbaarheid.
Yes, Maakbaarheid. It's this technocratic belief that with enough government intervention, enough data, and enough restrictions, we can perfectly control nature and literally engineer death out of the equation.
Gerbs explained that for frail, elderly individuals who are at the very end of their biological reserves, death is a reality, not a political failure.
Something is going to give them the final push.
Exactly. It might be a broken hip from a fall in the kitchen, it might be a severe seasonal influenza, or it might be COVID. Trying to freeze all of society and shut down the entire medical system to prevent that one specific virus from being the final push is a dangerous denial of biological reality.
And by focusing with absolute obsessive tunnel vision on preventing COVID deaths, the system actively generated massive hidden casualties in literally every other department.
He gives a deeply painful example to illustrate this. A patient needs a knee replacement. The politicians on TV, looking at their models, say, oh, it's fine, it's an elective surgery. Just wait 6 months so we can keep the beds open for COVID.
Right.
But Gerbs explains the physiological cascade of what waiting 6 months actually does to a human body.
It's not just a matter of keeping the joint in a holding pattern. The body is an interconnected system.
Exactly. If your knee is destroyed, you can't walk properly. If you can't walk, you lose muscle mass rapidly. Because you can't exercise, your cardiovascular health begins to deteriorate.
And you're in pain.
You are in constant chronic pain, which floods your body with cortisol and systemic inflammation, which then leads to severe depression. By the time that patient finally gets the surgery 6 months later, their baseline physiological health is ruined.
Yeah.
The surgery itself is now exponentially riskier, the recovery is harder, and their overall quality of life has been permanently reduced.
The damage is profound, but it is totally invisible to the state.
So this is the ultimate question. Why is it that a COVID death was treated as a catastrophic political failure that required national lockdowns, but a death from a delayed heart surgery or a life ruined by a delayed knee replacement was just shrugged off as an unavoidable, sad tragedy?
It brings us right back to the very beginning of the transcript, back into the Mirror Palace. It is about the models. Mathematical models can only track what they are programmed to track.
The dashboard blindness.
Yes. COVID infections and ICU admissions were fed into a daily dashboard that was broadcast to the entire nation every single evening.
Right.
Delayed cancer diagnoses were not on the dashboard. The physiological and psychological misery of a delayed knee replacement cannot be quantified on a daily ticker.
So it just doesn't exist to them.
Exactly. The technocratic system became systemically, mathematically blind to any human suffering that occurred outside its pre-programmed metrics.
Which is a terrifying realization. If the dashboard doesn't see your pain, the government doesn't care about it. And that leads perfectly into the final critical theme of this live event. How do we fix this?
Yeah, how do we build a system that doesn't just stare at a digital dashboard while the rest of society burns down?
Right. This was the core mission of De Weerd Golf, the organization co-hosting the event. The name itself, the Fourth Wave, is highly symbolic.
Historically, you can look at the evolution of Dutch democracy in waves. You have the constitutional reforms of 1848.
Okay.
Then the establishment of universal suffrage in the early 20th century, and the post-World War II expansion of the welfare state and social rights.
So this group is arguing that we now need a fourth wave of democratic evolution to protect citizens from the overreach of technocratic crisis management.
Exactly. Their core argument is that a democracy simply cannot put fundamental human rights in the freezer for 2 years.
A crisis mandate, where the executive branch bypasses Parliament to handle an acute emergency, is meant for 2 weeks. It is not a permanent style of government.
Renske Leijten, the former member of parliament on the panel, makes a truly powerful connection here to really drive the point home. She is famous in the Netherlands for being one of the key figures who exposed the Toos Ligon affair.
The child care benefits scandal.
Yep.
For our international listeners, That scandal literally brought down the entire Dutch government in 2021. What exactly happened there?
So, in the Toesliken affair, the Dutch tax authority used a self-learning algorithm, a model to detect tax fraud among parents receiving childcare subsidies.
Right.
But the algorithm was flawed and biased. It flagged thousands of completely innocent parents as fraudsters over tiny administrative errors or just dual nationalities.
That's right.
The government demanded they repay tens of thousands of euros immediately, financially ruining families, causing divorces, pushing people into deep poverty.
And Leijten draws a direct mechanical parallel between that algorithmic cruelty and the COVID response. She notes that in both the tax scandal and the pandemic, mathematical models and a faceless technocratic bureaucracy completely crushed the lives of individual citizens.
Yeah.
And in both cases, when citizens screamed for help, the political culture responded with, "We hear you, but the computer says you are a fraud," or the computer says you can't open your restaurant.
The mechanism of oppression is identical. The bureaucracy replaces human judgment with an algorithm.
So the panel debates tangible solutions. Leijten strongly advocates for the implementation of a binding citizens' referendum as a democratic emergency brake.
Right. If the technocrats are pushing a mandate that fundamentally alters the fabric of society, the citizens must have a direct mechanism to pull the cord and just say, stop.
Marta Smits offers a slightly different structural solution. She suggests that during a crisis, we need to completely decentralize the response.
Give far more mandate to local mayors who actually know their communities, rather than centralizing power in a national counterterrorism agency.
She points to the historical precedent of the Spanish flu a century ago, right?
Yeah, during that pandemic, policies were heavily localized. If a specific town in the Netherlands had a severe outbreak, the local mayor closed the local school.
Makes sense.
There wasn't a blanket, one-size-fits-all national lockdown dictated from an office in The Hague that applied equally to a densely populated city and a remote farming village.
Because localizing decisions keeps the power close to the people who are actually affected by it. A mayor has to look the restaurant owner in the eye at the grocery store. A national modeler does not.
Exactly. And the transcript emphasizes that waiting for the government to fix itself is completely useless. Citizen action is the only driving force for change.
Leijten recounts her own political career, noting that they only won major battles like stopping wage dumping in the healthcare sector when they organized relentless, massive grassroots movements.
They didn't just write op-eds.
No. They traveled to every single town hall, they woke up sleeping labor unions, and they physically gathered 500,000 signatures.
They proved that exact point on the very day of this broadcast.
They really did.
Before stepping onto the stage for this evening event, the panel members had marched to the Parliamentary Inquiry Committee. They presented a petition with nearly 10,000 signatures demanding that Professor Gerbs, the ICU doctor we've been talking about, be officially heard by the inquiry.
Because he had been completely ignored by the establishment.
Exactly. They also presented the committee with two very specific physical books. One was In COVID's Wake, written by Princeton professors, which details the global lack of empirical evidence for the efficacy of strict lockdowns.
And the second one.
The second was called Coronasporin, or Corona Traces.
And that second book is so crucial. It's a collection of deeply personal, heartbreaking stories from everyday citizens whose lives and businesses and mental health were destroyed by the measures.
Handing over a book of personal human stories to a bureaucratic committee investigating a crisis is a deeply symbolic act.
It is a literal attempt to force the human element back into the machinery of the state.
It is a demand to look past the dashboard.
So, if we synthesize this entire event, what is the ultimate takeaway for the listener?
Well, if you are listening to this and you feel a creeping sense of being overwhelmed by a world and a government that increasingly relies on algorithms, digital dashboards, and automated models to dictate your life, this transcript is a flare shot into the night sky.
It's a warning.
It is a warning that your only real defense against a technocracy is to organize locally, to speak up unapologetically, and to demand that the state treats you as a complex, moral human being with agency, not just a data point to be managed.
It's a call to repoliticize the things that the experts have tried to depoliticize, to refuse the psychological comfort of the mirror palace.
What an absolute marathon of a journey through this source material.
I know, right? We've unpacked Mona Keijzer's terrifying funnel of unquestionable models. We examined how handing the steering wheel to the NCTV militarized a public health response.
We explored the deeply concerning reality of scientists like Walk and Gerbs being chilled into silence by institutional groupthink.
We shined a light on the devastating, unseen collateral damage of Code Dark Gray. And we ended with that passionate demand for a grassroots revival of democratic rights.
And as we close, it is absolutely essential to reiterate our opening parameter.
Yes, the disclaimer.
The claims, the anecdotes, and the historical comparisons made in this transcript by these speakers are incredibly heavy. They are fiercely critical of the Dutch government, the established medical hierarchy, and the broader scientific community.
And our purpose in this deep dive was not to declare their narrative as the absolute truth.
Exactly. Our purpose was to extract their perspectives, explain the underlying logic of their arguments, and lay out their philosophical framework so that you can evaluate the validity of their claims for yourself.
We dissect the anatomy of the argument. You decide if the body holds up. But before we sign off, I know you always have one last conceptual grenade to roll into the room. Give me a final thought to chew on.
Well, if we zoom out from the COVID-19 pandemic entirely, the core warning of this transcript becomes even more urgent.
Okay.
We are currently moving at breakneck speed into an era governed by artificial intelligence. Our societal reliance on complex models and technocratic automated decision-making is only going to accelerate exponentially.
Okay, I see where you're going with this, and it's making me very nervous.
Think about the mechanics of what we just discussed. The speakers today argued that a mathematical model built by identifiable human experts who could theoretically be questioned created a hall of mirrors that effectively suspended democratic norms and human rights during a crisis.
Right.
So what happens tomorrow when the model making the decisions isn't an epidemiological spreadsheet, but a black box AI?
An algorithm so complex and opaque that not even the programmers fully understand how it weights its variables.
Exactly. What happens when the AI tells the politicians that to prevent a climate collapse or an economic crash, specific rights must be suspended?
Wow.
If our democracy struggled this profoundly to remain resilient against a human-made spreadsheet, will it be remotely ready for a crisis declared, managed, and legally enforced by an algorithm that no human can actually audit?
The Mirror Palace won't just be unaccountable. It will be entirely inhuman. That is a deeply chilling thought to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this intense, expansive deep dive into the Dwarsnieuws transcript.
It was a ride.
We hope tearing down these concepts helped give you some clarity in the muddy waters of crisis governance. Keep questioning the consensus, keep looking past the dashboard, and most importantly, stay curious. We'll catch you on the next one.